Imagine a war where the primary weapon was not a sword, but a compass. The story you are about to hear will completely overturn your understanding of ancient battles. This is the tale of how a 74-year-old man, using nothing but mathematics, humiliated the most terrifying army in the world, reducing hardened killers to tears of primal terror before an invisible monster. You will learn how the laws of physics tossed massive ships into the air like toys, and why Roman legionaries, who had conquered half the world, fled in panic at the mere sight of a rope on a wall. But this is not just about engineering miracles. We will uncover the dark side of triumph, why a great general wept looking at the city he himself ordered to be sacked, and how a ridiculous accident cut short the life of a genius whose blueprints were worth more than all the gold of the empire. A finale awaits you, where the student surpassed the teacher in cruelty, orchestrating a slaughter in which war elephants trampled their own army, and history's greatest strategist was betrayed by his own countrymen. Stay until the end to understand how, on the ashes of a burned fleet and the blood of a single scientist, that ruthless empire was born. An empire whose methods still frighten us thousands of years later. Welcome to real history, where intellect is the deadliest weapon. Imagine the sound that begins the end of the world. It is not a clap of thunder or the wail of a trumpet. It is the dry, almost delicate creak of a taut rope, the click of a wooden lever, and only then, the scream of 1,000 men who suddenly realize they are no longer hunters, they are prey. We are at the walls of Syracuse. The year is 212 BC, although for the men down on the decks, time has just stopped. Breathe in this air. It smells not only of salt and seaweed, but is thick with the sticky scent of overconfidence. The Roman Republic, that insatiable she-wolf, has come for her next meal. 60 heavy quinqueremes, floating fortresses bristling with iron and leather, tear through the waves of the Mediterranean. On the flagship stands Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a legend, the sword of Rome, a man who walked through the fire of Gaul and survived the meat grinder with Hannibal. Look at his face. Do you see fear there? Not a drop. Only the cold calculation of a professional, here to take what belongs to him by the right of might. He looks at the white walls of Syracuse and sees not a city, but a trophy. At his disposal is the finest military machine of antiquity. Legionaries whose discipline turns the chaos of battle into a routine task of removing obstacles. And most importantly, Marcellus has an ace up his sleeve, the Sambuca. Look at these monstrous constructions lashed to the sides of paired ships. These are siege towers, wide bridges capable of delivering a cohort of killers right onto the battlements, bypassing moats and fortifications. Roman engineers were proud of them. It was a triumph of logic and carpentry. Marcellus was certain no city could stand when the Sambuca lowered its heavy tongue onto the parapet. He thought he was bringing death, but he didn't know that death was already waiting for him. And it didn't have a sword, it had a compass. On the other side of the wall, in the dusty silence of a workshop, sits a 74-year-old man, Archimedes. He wears no armor. His hands are not calloused from a gladius, but covered in chalk and ink. For the Romans, war is valor, sweat, and blood. For Archimedes, war is a physics problem, and he has already found the solution. The Roman fleet approaches. Do you hear the rhythm of the drums setting the pace for the rowers? Beat, stroke, beat, stroke. Inevitability. Marcellus gives the signal. The ships close in on the walls. The Sambucas begin to rise, pulleys creaking, ready to vomit a stream of legionaries onto the heads of the defenders. The Romans are laughing. They see empty walls. Where is the garrison? Where are the archers? Have the Greeks already surrendered? And then, reality breaks. Instead of men, giant wooden beams appear above the walls. They look like the necks of prehistoric monsters, slowly and eerily turning toward the sea. The legionaries freeze, heads tilted back. What is this? Magic? No. It is mechanics. With a deafening whistle cutting through the air, stone blocks weighing 10 talents break loose from the beams. 250 kilograms of fury, accelerated by gravity and leverage. This is not an artillery barrage. This is sniper fire with boulders. The stones do not hit people. They hit the structure. Imagine what happens to a ship when a block weighing 1/4 of a ton falls on its deck from a bird's eye view.
The wood explodes into splinters, turning into shrapnel.
The sambucas, the pride of Roman engineering, shatter like dry twigs under a boot. Massive structures collapse onto the heads of the attackers themselves, breaking spines and smashing through the hulls of ships. But that was only the beginning. Archimedes had prepared something far more terrifying than stones for his guests. The Iron Hand. Have you ever seen a child grab a toy boat in the bathtub? Now scale that up to the size of a nightmare. The walls of Syracuse seem to come alive. Huge cranes, invisible until this moment, lower iron chains with monstrous hooks on the ends. These talons, resembling the claws of birds of prey, dig into the prows of the Roman galleys. The screech of metal on wood makes blood run cold. And then, the impossible happens. A lever inside the city moves. Counterweights, hidden behind the walls, drop down, and giant warships, weighing hundreds of tons, begin to rise out of the water. Straight up by the nose. Look at the faces of the Romans. These men have seen Hannibal's elephants. They have seen mountains of corpses at Cannae. But they have never seen gravity stop working. Their world has flipped, literally. Soldiers encased in heavy armor roll down the deck, piling into a heap, screaming in terror as their ship rears up like a crazed horse. The claw holds the ship vertical. A second of silence, in which only the splashing of water and the prayers of the doomed are heard. And then, a sudden release. The ship falls back into the sea from the height of the fortress wall. The water does not receive it softly. The impact against the surface is like hitting concrete. The hull snaps in half. The galley disappears into a whirlpool, dragging hundreds of lives down with it. The water in the harbor turns brown, but not from silt. Marcellus watches this from the bridge of his flagship. His face is a plaster mask.
He realizes that his tactics, his experience, his legions,
All of it is meaningless. You cannot pierce a parabola with a sword. You cannot intimidate a lever. This was not a fight. It was a demonstration. Archimedes showed Rome that intellect is also a weapon, and a far more terrible one than any spear. At that moment, watching the sinking wreckage of his greatness, Marcellus realized a bitter truth. The winners write the laws of war, but the laws of physics are the same for everyone. And today, those laws were on the side of Syracuse. Panic seizes the fleet. Ships try to turn around, oars tangle and collide. Captains scream, trying to shout over the chaos. "Back! Pull back to distance!" rings out over the water. The Romans think salvation lies in distance. If they back away from the walls, the iron claws won't reach them. Naive. They think they are fighting soldiers who have physical limits. But they are fighting mathematics. And mathematics has long arms. When the Roman galleys paddle away from the cursed walls in terror, hoping to find safety in the open sea, they don't yet know that Archimedes has anticipated this too. He simply changes the variables in his equation of death. You think retreat is salvation? In any other war, yes, If you break distance, the enemy's sword won't reach you. The spear will fall short. But Marcellus made a fatal mistake. He forgot who he was playing against. He thought he was fighting a garrison. He was fighting geometry. As soon as the Roman captains, voices hoarse, gave the order to row to a safe distance, an invisible switch clicked in Syracuse. Archimedes hadn't just built big catapults. He had created a layered system of fire. This was the smart artillery of antiquity, tuned for any range. As soon as the galleys moved away from the walls to escape the iron claws, the air filled with a new sound. If before it was a whistle, now it was a hum. A deep, low hum that vibrated the diaphragm. Long-range throwing machines opened up from the upper tiers of the citadel. Stones weighing tens of kilograms did not fly at random. They traveled in perfect parabolas. Archimedes turned the battlefield into a drafting board, where every point on the water had its coordinates. And the Roman fleet was now in a sector of guaranteed destruction. Imagine the chaos. The galleys were bunched together, trying to turn. Oars snapped against each other with cracks sounding like gunshots. And into this huddled, panicking mass, boulders began to fall. There was no need to even aim at a specific ship. The density of the Roman formation worked against them. Every stone found a victim. Impact. The deck is smashed through to the hold. Impact. The mast falls, crushing rowers chained to their benches. They don't even see death. They only hear the cracking of wood and the screams of comrades. And then salt water fills their mouths. But the worst awaited those who decided land was safer than water. Some of the legionaries, whose ships had wrecked on the shore, tried to break through to the walls on foot. These were elite fighters, veterans who had taken cities by storm dozens of times. They locked shields, formed a testudo, and moved forward. They thought their bronze and wood would protect them. Naive. In the walls of Syracuse, which seemed like a solid monolith, hundreds of tiny holes suddenly opened. Loopholes. From these black holes, scorpions, light, rapid-fire bolt throwers, stared at the Romans. It was a slaughter. The testudo crumbled in seconds. Heavy bolts punched through shields, pinning legionaries' arms to their own armor. Arrows struck through the slits of helmets, into unprotected legs, into necks. This was not a battle. This was an execution. The Romans didn't even see the enemy. They were fighting a stone wall that spat death. Marcellus stood on the deck of his surviving ship and watched as his army, the best army in the world, was turned into mincemeat. He was furious. His face turned purple, veins on his neck bulged. He was used to the enemy being a man. A man can be intimidated, deceived, killed. But how do you kill a formula? How do you intimidate a mechanism? He saw his soldiers, having lost all semblance of formation, running. Running not from an opponent, but from space itself, which had become hostile. The water killed. The air killed. The walls killed. What is worth more? One genius brain or a legion of disciplined killers? This question probably pulsed in the temples of every centurion that morning. The answer was floating around them. Severed limbs, debris of expensive paneling, helmets with red crests bobbing on the waves. Intellect won. Brute force, multiplied by overconfidence, was not just stopped, it was humiliated. The Roman landing force was destroyed without ever touching the ground with their famous short swords. Those who didn't drown or get crushed by rocks lay on the coastal pebbles, stuck with arrows like pincushions. The organized assault turned into a chaotic pile-up. The screams of the wounded drowned out officers' commands.
The sea at Syracuse turned a dirty, rusty color. It was the blood of the Republic, flowing from the open wound of its pride. Marcellus, clenching his teeth until they ground together, gave the only possible order: full retreat. This decision did not come easily to him. For a Roman consul to retreat before a bunch of Greeks and one senile old man was a shame worse than death. But Marcellus was a pragmatist. He realized, today he lost. The Roman war machine, that steel steamroller meant to flatten Sicily, hit a diamond cutter and broke its gears. When the remnants of the fleet retreated to the horizon to lick their wounds, there was no jubilation in Syracuse.
There was silence. The defenders looked at their machines, at their levers and pulleys, and couldn't believe what had happened. They hadn't just fought back. They had ground a superpower into dust without stepping outside the fortress walls. Archimedes dipped his hands in chalk again. For him, this wasn't a miracle. The equation balanced. The variable Rome had been cancelled out. But for the Romans shivering on the surviving ships, the world had changed forever. They stopped believing in their invincibility. But worse, a sticky, cold poison began to seep into their hearts, hardened in hundreds of battles. A poison more terrible than any sword. Fear of the unknown. The soldiers looked at the distant walls of the city and saw not stone. They saw a monster. A beast with hundreds of eyes and long iron arms. And they knew this monster was still hungry. Marcellus understood. Taking this city by storm was impossible. Steel was powerless here. That meant tactics had to change.
If a lion cannot be stabbed, it must be starved. But he did not yet know that the seeds of terror sown that day had already sprouted. And this fear, born under a hail of stones and whistling arrows, would become a trial for the Roman army more terrible than any open battle. A psychological break had occurred, and the crack running through the foundation of Roman discipline would soon turn into an abyss. Because when a soldier starts to believe that he is fighting not men, but gods or demons, he stops being a soldier. He becomes a victim. And this victim now peered with horror at the outlines of the walls, expecting something to fly out for which there was no name in Latin. Fear is not just an emotion. It is an infection. And in the Roman camp outside Syracuse, an epidemic began. After the sea washed the debris of galleys ashore and the earth drank the blood of the landing force, the legions fell ill with a new, previously unknown disease. Historians would call it Archimedophobia.
But for the soldiers trembling in their tents, it was simply primal terror of the invisible. Imagine a legionary. This is a man who does not fear an elephant. He does not fear a barbarian with an axe. He can stand in line when a chariot charges him. But now, these stern men, conquerors of the world, turned into hysterical children. It reached the point of absurdity. If a sentry on the wall noticed a simple rope or wooden beam appearing above the fortress battlements, a wail would roll through the Roman camp. "He's aiming his machines at us again!" Whole maniples abandoned their posts and ran. Experienced centurions, who had been through fire and water, fell face down in the mud and covered their heads with their hands, expecting a strike from the heavens. It seemed to them that every piece of wood sticking out from the wall was a finger of that geometric monster, ready to crush them like ants.
Archimedes achieved what no general could. He broke the will of the Roman army without even leaving his study. Marcellus looked at this disgrace and ground his teeth. His steel steamroller had rusted from fear. He tried to joke to somehow raise morale, but his jokes tasted of the bitterness of defeat. "It seems," he told his officers, looking at the impregnable walls, "this geometer uses our ships as ladles to pour himself seawater. and has driven us out in disgrace like naughty schoolboys, beating us with his multi-armed science. He called Archimedes a mythological Briareus, a 100-handed giant. And there was truth in that. For the Romans, one old man replaced an entire army. But Marcellus wouldn't be great if he didn't know how to admit the obvious. A direct attack is suicide. Continuing the assault means simply feeding his men to the mechanisms. And Rome, for all its power, did not have infinite men. And then Marcellus did what any predator does when the prey proves too prickly. He decided not to bite. He decided to strangle. Furl the banners, dig ditches. We won't take them by force. We will take them by time. The blockade began. The most exhausting, boring, and dirty kind of war. The Romans dug in. A wall of palisades and earth grew around the city, cutting Syracuse off from the outside world. A brilliant operation turned into a dreary sitting in the mud. Days, weeks, months dragged on. Autumn turned to winter, winter to spring. 8 long months. Can you imagine what 8 months of silence is like in war? It is worse than combat. In combat, you have adrenaline. In a blockade, you only have lice, bad food, and endless waiting. Soldiers went crazy from idleness. They looked at the white walls of Syracuse, shining in the sun like a mockery. There, inside, life was bustling. There they drank wine. There they slept in soft beds. And here, in the tents, it smelled of the sweat of unwashed bodies and hopelessness. But it was in this silence that Rome's true victory ripened. Marcellus understood. Archimedes' genius could calculate the flight path of a stone, but he could not calculate the trajectory of human stupidity or hunger. Machines do not get tired, but the people who operate them do. Syracuse was proud. They had beaten back an attack by a superpower. They felt invulnerable, and this sense of safety became their poison. When you see an enemy every day who just sits and does nothing, you stop fearing him. You start thinking the war is somewhere far away. Vigilance dulls. Sentries start dozing at their posts. Officers allow themselves an extra cup of wine. They think we are sleeping, thought Marcellus, looking at the city lights. But we are not sleeping. We are waiting. The Roman consul turned into a hunter, sitting in ambush by a burrow. He knew that sooner or later the beast would make a mistake. Someone would forget to lock a door. Someone would get drunk. Someone would betray. The war of minds moved to a new phase. It was no longer physics. It was the psychology of survival. Marcellus began looking not for breaches in the walls, but for breaches in people. He sent spies. He conducted negotiations. He looked for weakness. And one day, chance provided him an opportunity. There was no brilliant plan, no complex strategy. There was simple human loose talk. During negotiations for the ransom of prisoners, one of the Roman soldiers, bored, began counting the bricks in the wall near the Galleagra tower. He just looked and estimated the height. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20. The soldier wasn't an engineer. He was practical. He noticed that the wall was lower there than it seemed, and that the ladders they had would reach the top. This information, seemingly small and insignificant, landed on Marcellus's desk like a gold ingot. While Archimedes drew his circles, protecting the city with complex formulas, the fate of Syracuse hung on a simple arithmetic error by the builders and the attentiveness of one bored Roman. But a low wall alone isn't enough. You need the wall to be empty. You need a moment when the city's eyes close. And Marcellus, that old fox, knew when that would happen. He knew the Greeks better than they knew themselves. He knew their love for festivals. The time was approaching when Syracuse was to honor the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Irony of fate, while the city prepared to praise the huntress, it was turning into the game. Marcellus looked at the calendar. 3 days until the festival. 3 days until the moment when wine would flow like a river and discipline would dissolve in a drunken haze. 8 months of waiting were coming to an end. The silence of the blockade was about to explode, but not with the roar of stones, but with the quiet rustle of sandals on stone in a moonless night. The Roman machine, stopped by the genius of one man, was preparing to start its gears again. This time, the lubricant would not be mechanics, but human weakness. And while in Syracuse they rubbed statues of gods with oil and uncorked amphorae, in the Roman camp they sharpened short swords. The festival was going to be unforgettable, especially for those who wouldn't survive it. A heavy premonition hung in the air. Marcellus gave the order to prepare the assault ladders, but this time quietly. No trumpets, no shouting. Rome intended to enter Syracuse not through the front gates, but through the back door, which the hosts had carelessly left unlocked, caught up in a toast to their own greatness. Wine is a treacherous ally. It promises oblivion, but delivers death. That night, Syracuse was drowning in wine. The city was celebrating. For 3 days, the pious Greeks praised Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, an irony worthy of the best playwrights. While the citizens prayed to the patroness of hunters, they themselves became the prey. Marcellus did not believe in gods the way he believed in discipline. While sacrificial animals were slaughtered in the temples of Syracuse, and wine flowed like a river, washing away the fear of the 8-month siege, icy silence reigned in the Roman camp. No fires, no conversations. Only the dull clinking of weapons being wrapped in cloth so they wouldn't jingle at the decisive moment. Have you ever tried to climb a vertical wall in pitch darkness, knowing that one wrong sound is the end? Imagine 1,000 men, the elite, those who know how to kill quietly. They stand at the foot of the Galleagra Tower, the very place where the bored Roman counted the fatal error in the wall height. The ladders are placed. They are perfectly sized. Roman logistics does not make mistakes twice. The first legionary touches the parapet. He holds his breath. What awaits him? A spear in the face? An alarm? No. Emptiness awaits him. The tower sleeps. The guard, exhausted by the festival and confident in the impregnability of their machines, is drunk or absent. Archimedes' genius built the perfect defense, but he didn't factor in the human element. Walls can be high, catapults powerful, but if the sentry sleeps, the fortress has already fallen. The Romans flow into the city like black water, soundlessly, efficiently. This is not a battle. It is butcher's work on the night shift. Sleeping sentries are not woken. Their throats are simply slit with one hand, while the other covers their mouth. A wheeze, a gurgle, the thud of a body on the floor. Next. Tower after tower, section after section. No one strikes a gong. No one lights a signal fire. While the city finishes the last pitchers to Artemis's health, death is already walking its streets, and it is dressed in Roman armor. By dawn, the hexapolon gates open, but not with the roar of an assault, but with the treacherous creak of greased hinges. Marcellus's main army enters, and then, when the first rays of the sun touched the golden roofs of the temples, Syracuse woke up. But not to the singing of birds, but to a sound that freezes the blood. Trumpets.
dozens of Roman trumpets roaring in unison from the heights of Epipoli. This sound meant one thing: the old world was over. Imagine that moment of hungover horror. You open your eyes, your head splitting from yesterday's celebration. You go out into the street and see that your city is flooded with steel. Panic was instantaneous and absolute. People scurried like rats in a burning barn. Some tried to fight, others jumped from the walls, preferring a quick death to Roman captivity. Marcellus climbed to a high point and looked at the city lying at his feet. They say he wept. Historians like to write about his nobility, about how he pitied the great Greek polis doomed to destruction. Don't believe it. These were not tears of pity. These were tears of tension, releasing him for the first time in 2 years. He looked at the richest city in the world and knew, now it all belonged to him. But with triumph came a problem. The Roman army is not a scalpel, it is a hammer. When the hammer falls, it smashes everything. Soldiers who had rotted in trenches for 8 months looked at the palaces of Syracuse with hungry eyes. They saw gold. They saw women. They saw payback for their humiliations, for the fear of the iron hands, for their fallen comrades. Marcellus understood. He was holding a rabid dog on a leash, and the leash was about to snap. He gave the order. Free people are your prey. Property is your prey. But do not burn the city, and do not touch Archimedes. Why did he want to save the old man? Out of respect for science? Unlikely. Romans were pragmatists. Archimedes was the most valuable trophy in this city. A living Archimedes was worth more than all the gold in the temples. Marcellus wanted to bring this brain to Rome. He wanted this intellect to work for the Republic. A genius to some is a nuisance to a legionary's boot. But for a smart general, a genius is a resource. However, generals' orders often get lost in the noise of slaughter. When the sun rose higher, the gates of discipline collapsed completely. The legions spilled into the streets. The looting began. That terrible word behind which hide 1,000 personal tragedies. Doors were kicked in. The screams of women mixed with the crash of breaking pottery and the tearing of fabric. The victors took what was theirs. Syracuse, the pearl of the Greek world, the city of arts and philosophy, was turning into a pile of scrap. Statues were thrown from pedestals just to scrape off the gilding. Scrolls with priceless knowledge were trampled by boots because a soldier doesn't know how to read. He only knows how to count loot. History held its breath that day. A great civilization built on reason and beauty clashed with a civilization built on force and order. And force was winning. The chaos of looting swept through the streets, rising higher to the wealthy quarters, to where, in his house, forgetting the war, sat a man whose name would outlive both Rome and Carthage. While blood flowed in the streets, in a quiet room scattered with sand for drawings, time flowed differently. There was no war there, only geometry. But war does not tolerate being ignored. It has a habit of kicking down doors. And now the heavy steps of fate were already sounding in the corridor of Archimedes' house. Steps that would forever change the history of science. The door didn't open. It exploded into the room. The hinges flew out with chunks of wood, and a shaft of bright, eye-cutting Sicilian sun burst into the gloom. In the doorway stood a silhouette. Broad shoulders, square shield, short sword dripping with something dark. A legionary. He breathed heavily, wheezing. Adrenaline hammered in his temples. He had just gone through the hell of street fighting, where death could wait around every corner. He was looking for loot.
He was looking for gold, silver, hidden slaves, everything the consul had promised him from months of sitting in mud and fear of the iron hands. But instead of a treasury, he saw a dusty room. There were no chests here, no frightened women, just sand. It covered the floor in an even layer, and circles, triangles, and lines were drawn on this sand. In the center of this strange geometry, back to the door, sat an old man. He was 75 years old. His tunic was simple, almost beggarly. He didn't even turn around at the crash. Picture this scene. Two universes collided in one room. On one side, Rome. Young, sweaty, smelling of iron and blood, full of animal strength and ignorance. On the other, Hellas. Decrepit, immersed in abstractions, forgetting reality for the sake of seeking truth. The soldier took a step forward. The floor creaked under the weight of a caliga studded with nails. "Get up!" he barked. His voice cracked into a squeal. "To Marcellus! Move!" Archimedes didn't flinch. He looked at the drawing. A battle far grander than the storming of Syracuse was unfolding in his head right now. He was solving a problem. He was seeking the harmony of the spheres. For him, the soldier's shout was just annoying noise, like the buzzing of a fly interfering with concentration. The Roman stepped closer. His shadow fell on the drawing, crossing out a perfect circle with an ugly, dark stripe. This infuriated the scientist more than the intrusion. "Step back," the old man muttered without raising his head. His voice was dry and irritated. "Don't block the sun." The soldier was taken aback. He was used to people falling to their knees and begging for mercy at the sight of a Roman sword. And this old man dared to order him. Him, the victor. Anger, fueled by wine and fatigue, flared instantly. "You're coming with me, old dog!" The legionary grabbed Archimedes by the shoulder, trying to jerk him up from the floor. Archimedes pulled away. His hand instinctively covered the drawn figures. He finally raised his eyes to the killer. There was no fear in them, only the contempt of intellect for brute force. "Noli turbare curculos meos," he shouted. "Do not disturb my circles." Those were the last words of the greatest mind of antiquity. The legionary didn't know the Latin of philosophers. He spoke the language of steel. His arm worked on reflex, a short swing of the gladius, a blow that put an end to the calculations. Archimedes didn't scream. He simply slumped to his side. The chalk fell from his fingers. Blood, thick and dark, gushed onto the sand, flooding the drawings. Perfect geometric lines dissolved in the chaos of biology. The problem remained unsolved. The universe he was building in his mind collapsed in a fraction of a second. The soldier stood over the body, breathing heavily. He wiped his sword on the dead man's tunic. He didn't even understand what he had just done. To him, it was just another stubborn old man who disobeyed an order. He didn't know he had destroyed a library the likes of which wouldn't be seen for another 1,500 years. He spat on the floor, kicked over a basket of scrolls, and went to look for loot in another house. When Marcellus was told what happened, he was furious. They say he ordered the killer executed, but who can sort out the truth in the dust of centuries now? Most likely, the consul just cursed. He lost an asset. He wanted to bring Archimedes to Rome as living proof of his triumph, as a tame mage who would build machines for the Republic. But he got only a corpse. Marcellus gave Archimedes a lavish funeral. He found his relatives and gifted them money. He placed a monument on the grave, a sphere inscribed in a cylinder, as the scientist himself had bequeathed. Hypocritical? Perhaps. But that is Rome. It kills culture, then builds a monument to it, appropriating its glory. Archimedes' death became a symbol. That day, in a dusty room, Rome finally ceased to be just a state of warrior farmers. It became an empire predator, devouring other people's knowledge, other people's art, other people's gods. Look at the streets of Syracuse in the following days. It was the largest looting in history up to that point. The Romans took everything. Statues by Praxiteles and Phidias were loaded onto carts like firewood. Paintings, vases, gold jewelry, all of it flowed to Rome to decorate the villas of senators and temples built with money from the sale of slaves. Romans, who just yesterday ate spelt and considered art the lot of effeminate Greeks, suddenly acquired a taste for luxury. Plutarch wrote that Marcellus taught the Romans to appreciate Hellenic elegance. What a grim joke. He taught them to steal Hellenic elegance. Greek culture didn't die. It was deported. It became a trophy. But amidst all this glitter of gold and marble, amidst the triumphant shouts and the smell of burning, Marcellus felt a strange chill. He stood by Archimedes' grave and looked at the fresh stone. He had won. Syracuse had fallen. Sicily was now a Roman province. The sword of Rome had proven its sharpness. But looking at the blood that had forever soaked into the drawings on the sand, becoming a seal on the sentence of the old, naive world of philosophers and lone heroes, Marcellus couldn't shake a heavy feeling. He understood that victory over the old man and his toys was just a prelude. The real threat was still breathing down his neck. Somewhere out there, on the foggy plains of Italy, the most terrifying predator of his time was still walking on Roman soil. A beast that could not be killed by geometry. And this beast was waiting for a meeting. While Syracuse mourned its treasures, and Roman galleys carried plundered gold to the mouth of the Tiber, the real war hadn't gone anywhere. It simply lurked in the hills of Italy, waiting for its main actors to return to the stage. Marcellus returned a triumphator, but he didn't seek peace. He was called the Sword of Rome, not for the beauty of his scabbard, but because he always had to be bloody. Unlike Fabius Maximus, who was the shield and preferred to wear the enemy down with endless maneuvers, Marcellus craved a fight. He was a heavyweight boxer looking for a knockout, and he had only one worthy target: Hannibal, the Ghost Man, the strategist who had tormented Italy for 15 years, turning its blooming fields into cemeteries. Hannibal wasn't just an enemy, he was an obsession. He destroyed consuls in batches. He erased legions at Cannae and Lake Trasimene. Romans were afraid to even speak his name aloud, lest they invite disaster. All except Marcellus. A game of cat and mouse began, stretching for years. Two aging lions circled each other across the sun-scorched Apulia. Marcellus pursued, forced battles, bit at the Carthaginian rearguard. Hannibal dodged, snapped back, and disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind empty granaries and poisoned wells. It was a war of attrition, a war of nerves. But even lions lose their sense of smell. The year 208 BC arrived. Both commanders were encamped near each other, close to the city of Venusia. Between them rose a wooded hill, an ideal position. Whoever occupied it would gain the advantage of height and visibility. Hannibal, that genius of ambushes, looked at the hill and saw not a tactical height, but a mousetrap. He knew how Romans thought. He knew their aggression, their greed for advantageous positions. So he didn't occupy the height with his infantry. Instead, he hid a detachment of Numidian cavalry in the thick brush at the foot. The best skirmishers in the world, capable of becoming invisible in 3 pine trees. Marcellus saw the hill and saw an opportunity. To him, a 5-time consul, conqueror of Gauls and captor of Syracuse, it seemed luck was his tame dog.
But that morning, the dog broke its chain. Instead of sending scouts or occupying the height with a full legion, Marcellus made a mistake that costs a private his life, but is unforgivable for a commander-in-chief. He decided to go look himself, personally. The old warrior wanted to feel the ground under his feet, wanted to see the enemy's disposition with his own eyes. It was the bravado of a dying era, an era when generals fought in the front ranks. He took only a small retinue with him, 200 horsemen, a handful of men against an army of predators. With him went his colleague, the second consul Crispinus. That day, Rome laid both its heads on the chopping block. They rode up the slope, discussing plans, joking, perhaps recalling past victories. The silence of the forest seemed safe to them. Birds sang, the wind rustled the leaves. But suddenly this rustle turned into a whistle. The Numidians appeared out of nowhere. It seemed the earth itself gave birth to the riders. They didn't form battle lines. They attacked like a swarm of hornets. Short javelins flew at the Romans from all sides. Imagine the chaos. Horses rearing, men falling to the ground pierced by spears before they can even draw their swords. The Romans try to regroup, to cover the consuls with their bodies, but the Numidians are too fast. They circle, showering the doomed men with iron, not engaging in close combat. The Etruscan horsemen from Marcellus's retinue wavered and fled. You can't blame them. They were caught in a meat grinder. Only a handful of faithful remained, huddled around the old consul. Marcellus fought. Even in his 60s, he remained a warrior. But a spear doesn't recognize rank. It doesn't ask how many triumphs you've celebrated. The sharp tip of a Numidian javelin struck Marcellus in the side, piercing his armor. The great sword of Rome tumbled from his saddle into the road dust like a sack of grain. The second consul, Crispinus, riddled with arrows, managed to break through and ride away, only to die of his wounds a few days later. But Marcellus remained lying on that cursed hill. When the noise of battle died down and the dust settled, Hannibal ascended the hill. He walked up to the body of his most persistent enemy. The soldiers around probably expected their commander to gloat, that he would spit on the corpse, order the head cut off and stuck on a pike to show the Romans their insignificance. But Hannibal stood silently. He looked into the dead man's face for a long time with an unreadable expression. There was no joy in that look. There was fatigue, and, perhaps, a strange sadness. Hannibal understood what his mercenaries did not. Marcellus was the last of the Mohicans. He was a mirror image of Hannibal himself, a warrior of honor, a man for whom war was a duel of wills, not just the accounting of death. A worthy end for a soldier, but a foolish one for a general, the Carthaginian might have said. But instead he took the signet ring from dead Marcellus's finger, not as a trophy for sale, but as a symbol of authority that now belonged to the victor. Then Hannibal ordered the impossible by the standards of cruel war. He ordered the enemy's body washed, dressed in rich robes, and cremated with military honors. He collected the ashes in a silver urn, placed a golden wreath upon it, and sent it to Marcellus's son. It was a gesture of chivalry in a world that was rapidly forgetting what chivalry was. Hannibal was saying goodbye not just to an enemy, he was saying goodbye to his time. Marcellus's death was a turning point. Rome lost its best fighter, but the paradox was that this worked in its favor. The death of old heroes cleared the way for something new. The heroic style of command, where a general gallops in front on a white horse and personally chops heads, proved its insolvency. Reconnaissance in force led by the commander-in-chief is not valor, it is criminal negligence. Marcellus was magnificent, but he was a man of the past. He believed in fury, in pressure, in personal example. But war was changing.
It was becoming cold, calculating, and impersonal. While Marcellus's funeral pyre burned down, sending smoke into the Italian sky, a new star was already rising in Rome. A man who did not seek glory in hand-to-hand combat. A man who looked at a map not as a battlefield, but as a chessboard. A man who would never ride to check a hill with a handful of horsemen, because there are specially trained people for that. Marcellus's death closed the chapter of the Iliad in the history of this war. Romance ended. The science of victory began, and the man who personified this science was already ready to flip the game board.
Rome would no longer defend. Rome would no longer chase ghosts through its hills. Rome was preparing to do what seemed unthinkable even to the boldest senators. Rome was preparing to become an invader. While the ashes of Marcellus's funeral pyre cooled in the wind, a very different fire was kindling in Rome. The fire of cold, ruthless intellect. A man was stepping onto the stage who didn't give a damn about heroic duels. Publius Cornelius Scipio. Remember that name. It is he who will turn Roman fury into a Roman system. Scipio was young, but his eyes had seen things that turned veterans gray. He was at Cannae. He saw Hannibal surround and slaughter the flower of the nation. He stood ankle-deep in the blood of his friends. Anyone else in his place would have broken, but Scipio did something only great predators are capable of. He learned. While others cursed the Carthaginian demon, Scipio studied him. He took apart the enemy's tactics like a mechanic takes apart a captured engine to understand how it works. And he understood the main thing. You cannot defeat Hannibal in Italy. This is his territory, his rules, his game. To kill the beast, you don't chop off its tail piece by piece. You burn its lair. Scipio's plan sounded like madness. Land in Africa. Strike at the very heart of the Carthaginian power, while Hannibal chases ghosts in the Italian foothills. The Senate was horrified. Old patricians, accustomed to the cautious war of Fabius Maximus, screamed in fear. "You want to leave Rome defenseless?" they yelled. "Hannibal is at our gates, and you're taking the legions across the sea!" Fabius, that shield of Rome, called the plan suicide. But Scipio looked at them not as sages, but as frightened old men whose time had run out. "Hannibal will not leave Italy as long as his home is safe," Scipio said, and the steel of a new era rang in his voice. "But the moment I put a torch to the gates of Carthage, he will run back like a beaten dog." It was a risk that takes your breath away. Imagine, you are betting the fate of a civilization, going against the will of your government, against the logic of defense, against fear. Scipio received no money from the Senate. He was not given the right to raise legions. What did he do? He gathered volunteers. He recruited those very canny fugitives, disgraced soldiers exiled to Sicily for defeat, thirsting for redemption in blood. He created an army of outcasts and ghosts. And so, in the year 204 BC, Roman ships cut through the waves off the African coast. When the first legionary stepped onto the sands of Africa, the world turned upside down. The war that had tormented Italy for 15 years suddenly knocked on the doors of those who paid for it. Carthaginian merchants, used to reading about battles in reports over dinner, suddenly smelled smoke. The Romans hadn't just come. They had come to destroy. Scipio acted not like a knight, but like a surgeon. He allied with the Numidian king Massinissa, another genius of betrayal and cavalry attack. Together they orchestrated a massacre in the Carthaginian camps. Night arsons, sudden raids, rich villas surrounded by gardens turned into ruins. Smoke from burning estates was visible from the walls of Great Carthage. Panic is a mild word for what began in the city.
The Council of Elders of Carthage, those arrogant oligarchs who for years hadn't sent reinforcements to Hannibal, fearing his growing power, now trembled with terror. They realized that money cannot stop a legion. They needed a sword. They needed their lion. Messengers raced to Italy. The order was brief and humiliating. Return. We are being killed. Imagine that moment. Hannibal Barca, the greatest general of his time, a man sworn to destroy Rome, receives the letter. He stands on the soil of Italy, which he has trampled for 15 years. He has not lost a single general battle here. He held a superpower by the throat for a decade and a half, and now he is ordered to let go. They say when Hannibal heard the order, he ground his teeth so hard it seemed they would crumble. He didn't curse Rome. He cursed Carthage. He cursed the very merchants who grudged gold for the war when victory was close, and now begged for salvation when it was too late. Rome did not defeat Hannibal, he would say later, watching the receding shore. Hannibal was defeated by the Carthaginian Senate with its envy and greed. It was a tragedy of antique proportions. An undefeated army loaded onto ships in Croton. Veterans whose faces were scarred in battles at Trasimene and Cannae wept. They were leaving not as victors returning in triumph. They were leaving as a fire brigade called to put out their own house. Hannibal looked at the Italian hills one last time. He knew he would never see them again. He was leaving behind his youth, his glory, and his brother, whose severed head had once been thrown into his camp by the Romans. He was leaving to meet the man who stole his tactics, studied his moves, and now waited for him in the sands of Africa like a mirror image. The change of the playing field was complete. Scipio's strategic genius worked perfectly. He pulled Hannibal out of his fortress, Italy, into the open field. Intellect and logistics defeated brute force and tactical skill. Wind filled the sails of the Carthaginian fleet. The armada sailed south to meet its destiny. Electric tension hung in the air. The whole world froze. Two of the greatest minds of the era, teacher and student, hammer and anvil, were converging. And it was clear to everyone, there was enough room on this earth for only one of them. In Carthage, they hoped Hannibal's return meant salvation, but Scipio wasn't going to give them a chance. He had waited for this meeting all his life. He was preparing not just a battle for Hannibal, he was preparing a lesson. A lesson on what happens when the old world of heroes collides with the new world of professional killers. And the exam was scheduled at a place called Zama. The sun stands at its zenith over the plain of Zama. The year 202 BC scorches the earth, turning the dust underfoot into white-hot ash. The air shimmers, distorting the horizon. But what the soldiers see is no mirage. It is the finale. The two greatest armies of antiquity, led by two geniuses, have finally met to decide who owns the future. Look at the Carthaginian formation. In the front row are not men. There stand 80 gray mountains, 80 war elephants. Never before had Hannibal assembled such a monstrous fist. These are the living tanks of the ancient world, machines of fear, capable of turning a legion into a bloody mess in minutes. Their tusks are bound in iron, their eyes bloodshot, and mahouts are ready to drive hooks into thick skin to send the beasts into a mad charge. Hannibal is betting on raw power. He knows Romans fear elephants. This fear has been ingrained in their genetic code since the time of Pyrrhus. He counts on the sight of charging giants breaking the Roman formation, confusing the maniples, and then his veterans will finish off the panicked men. This is the plan of an old master. Strike with the hammer before the opponent can raise the shield. But look at the Roman side. Scipio does not look frightened. He is calm as a mathematician before a chalkboard. He knows what Hannibal does not. Fear is just a variable that can be eliminated. Instead of the usual checkerboard order, where maniples stand staggered to cover gaps, Scipio aligns his troops in strange, straight columns. Between the units gape empty corridors, clear lanes running deep into the formation. To an inexperienced eye, this looks like suicide. "He opened the front!" armchair strategists in Rome might have screamed. But Scipio is not preparing a defense. He is preparing a trap. The signal sounds. Carthage's trumpets tear the silence. The earth begins to shake. Have you ever stood next to a train rushing at full speed? Multiply that by 80. An avalanche of flesh, weighing hundreds of tons, breaks loose. Elephants roar, dust rises like a wall, blocking the sun. It is an attack that should have ended the war in one blow. Roman recruits standing in the front rows turn pale. Instinct screams, "Run!" But iron discipline, beaten into them by corporals' staffs, and faith in their commander, holds them in place. Scipio waits. He waits for that very second when inertia can no longer be stopped. And then, when a collision seems inevitable, a miracle of geometry occurs. The Roman velites, light skirmishers, suddenly scatter to the sides, and before the charging elephants open those very empty corridors. Animals, even those trained to kill, are not idiots. They do not want to crash into a wall of spears if they see an open path. The instinct of self-preservation overrides the mahout's orders. The elephant avalanche does not smash into the Roman formation. It flows into it. The giants rush into these living lanes like water into sluices. And then, the trap snaps shut. From the sides, from a safe distance, a hail of javelins rains down on the animals. Legionaries strike at unprotected flanks, legs, trunks. Roman trumpets roar right into the animals' ears, driving them mad. The scene turns into chaos, but it is controlled chaos. Those elephants that didn't run all the way through, finding themselves useless in the Roman rear, fall into panic. Pain and noise disorient them. The living tanks turn around. Imagine the horror of the Carthaginian infantry. They're following the elephants, expecting to see crushed Romans. Instead, their own weapon is rushing at them. Enraged animals trample their own soldiers, break formation, turning Hannibal's vanguard into mincemeat. Hannibal watches this from the hill. His ace is beaten. His bet on primal horror lost to cold calculation. Scipio didn't stop force with force. He let it pass through him, like an Aikido master, and used the enemy's energy against him. The geometry of death worked flawlessly. The most terrible threat of antiquity was neutralized not by heroism, but by the correct placement of men on the field. Scipio turned the battlefield into a mechanism where every gear turned in the right direction. The dust gradually settles. On the field lie carcasses of animals looking like gray hills stuck with spears. The cries of wounded elephants mix with the curses of dying Carthaginians. Scipio doesn't even smile. For him, this was obvious. He knew biology would lose to discipline. But the battle has only begun. The elephants were just the prelude. Now that the tanks were burning on the field, the infantry entered the fray. Two steel masses, two walls of shields ready to clash in a deadly clinch. On one side, Hannibal's veterans, men who hadn't known defeat for 15 years. On the other, the new Roman machine, hungry to prove it is perfect. The air rang with tension. Scipio shifted his gaze to the center of the enemy formation. There, behind rows of mercenaries and militia, stood the old guard. The very men who crossed the Alps, who drank the water of Lake Trasimene colored with blood. They stood silently, grim and dangerous as death itself. They knew elephants were for show. Real work is done with sword and shield. Scipio understood. The tricks were over. Now would begin what they all gathered here for: a bloody, heavy, honest slaughter. And in this slaughter, the winner wouldn't be the one who hits harder, but the one who stays on his feet longer. The student looked into the teacher's eyes across the field of death separating them. The geometry lesson was over. The anatomy lesson was beginning. The elephants were burning. But a battle doesn't end when pieces are removed from the board. It ends when the player is broken. And now, in the center of the dusty plain of Zama, the real work began. No tricks, no magic. Iron against iron. Will against will. Scipio watched his infantry slam into the Carthaginian line. It was a sound like a giant hammer hitting an anvil, a single deafening clang of thousands of shields colliding in 1 second. Roman hastati and principes, young and angry, pushed forward. But they hit a wall. Facing them were not mercenaries fighting for money. Facing them was Hannibal's old guard, veterans of Italy. The men who had marched with him through the Alps, froze in snows, starved in swamps, and killed Romans at Cannae and Lake Trasimene. They had forgotten what their home looked like, but they remembered how to win. They stood to the death. The Roman attack bogged down. Imagine the despair of a legionary who strikes with his sword, putting all his strength into the blow, but sees before him not fear, but the cold, empty eyes of a professional killer, simply waiting for the moment to counterattack. Hannibal's formation didn't bend. It sprung back. Scipio felt a chill run down his spine. He realized, in a head-on collision, his boys would lose. Hannibal's veterans had something not found in Roman manuals: the experience of 15 years of continuous slaughter. The scales slowly but surely began to tip in Carthage's favor. Rome's infantry began to back up, centimeter by centimeter. A step back is the beginning of flight. At that moment, the fate of the battle was being decided not in the center, but on the flanks. There, something was happening that would be the key to Scipio's victory, or his greatest failure. The Roman cavalry, under the command of Gaius Laelius, and the Numidian horsemen of the traitor Massinissa, struck the wings of Hannibal's army. It was a fierce, brief clash. The Carthaginian horsemen, outnumbered and outspirited, couldn't hold. They turned their horses and fled. The Romans and Numidians, drunk with the thrill of the chase, surged after them. Scipio followed them with his eyes, and perhaps, in that moment, his heart skipped a beat. His cavalry, his main hope, had vanished. They disappeared over the horizon, chasing the fleeing enemy. The battlefield emptied. Only the infantry boxes, gnawing at each other in the center, remained. The silence on the flanks became louder to Scipio than any scream. He was left alone, without support, with an army slowly being ground down by Hannibal's veterans. Half an hour passed. An hour. No cavalry. Where were they? Caught up in looting the baggage train? Exhausted horses? Or fell into an ambush? Hannibal, standing behind his lines, surely smirked. He saw the Roman formation cracking. He threw his reserves into the fight. He smelled victory. That familiar metallic scent he inhaled at Cannae. It seemed history was repeating itself. The Roman upstart overestimated himself. Intellect loses to brute experience. Scipio's infantry held on pure stubbornness. Men slipped in bloody mud, stepped over comrades' bodies, closed ranks, but there were fewer and fewer of them.
The wall of shields was thinning. And then the earth shook again. At first, it sounded like distant thunder. Then, like the roar of the surf. Hannibal turned around. He hoped to see his horsemen regrouped and returning. But through the clouds of dust on the horizon, familiar outlines emerged. Roman standards. Numidian turbans. Laelius and Massinissa hadn't gotten carried away. They hadn't run off. They accomplished their task, drove the enemy cavalry to a state where it could no longer return to the fight, and did what distinguishes a great army from a rabble. They turned around. The cavalry was returning, but not to their positions. They were coming for the rear of the Carthaginian infantry. Hannibal froze. In that second, he saw not just enemy horsemen, he saw himself. 15 years ago, at Cannae, he destroyed a Roman army exactly like this, tied them up in combat from the front, and struck with cavalry in the back. It was his signature move, his masterpiece. And now, his student, this Roman boy, was using his own brush to paint the picture of his demise. Cannae in reverse. A mirror of tactics. The horsemen smashed into the rear of the Carthaginian infantry with monstrous force. A spear strike in the back is not just a wound. It is a psychological shock that breaks any discipline. Veterans, who had just been pushing back the Romans and seeing victory before them, suddenly found themselves in a bag. The ring closed. Scipio didn't just surround the enemy. He created a perfect destruction machine. From the front, Roman infantry getting a second wind. From the rear, heavy cavalry. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It was the moment of truth. The student surpassed the teacher not because he invented something new, but because he learned the lesson perfectly. Scipio showed Hannibal that his methods were universal, that genius can be copied, taken apart, and reassembled, directed against the creator. On the field of Zama, a massacre began. Hannibal's veterans didn't surrender. They knew there would be no mercy. They fought back to back, forming living islands of resistance in a sea of Roman steel. But it was agony. When you are attacked from all sides, your skill no longer matters. You are simply crushed by mass and geometry. Hannibal watched his army perish. His old guard, his brothers in arms, were turning into statistics. He saw not just a formation collapsing, Carthage itself was collapsing. Every soldier's death brought the end of the great city closer. Scipio watched the finale with the cold detachment of a surgeon finishing a complex amputation. He knew he was causing pain, but he knew it was necessary for Rome to live. He cut out the tumor that threatened the Republic, and he did it with a tool he had sharpened himself. Dust raised by thousands of feet and hooves hid the sun, but it was clear to everyone. Sunset would come earlier than usual today, and it would be the sunset of an entire era. Hannibal, the great tactician, the man who could outplay anyone, lost to himself, to his own reflection in Roman armor. The ring tightened. Screams became quieter, replaced by wheezing. History was drawing a line under the great confrontation, and the ink for this line was red. When the dust over the plain of Zama settled, revealing the gruesome geometry of thousands of bodies, a solitary horseman galloped away from the battlefield. Hannibal Barca. The man who had held Rome by the throat for 15 years was now running to save his life. It wasn't just a general's escape. It was the end of the age of lone heroes. Hannibal returned to Carthage not with triumph, but with a truth sharper than any sword. He entered the Council of Elders, to the very people who had begrudged money for his campaigns, and told them straight to their faces, "We have not lost a battle. We have lost the war."
Imagine this scene. The great commander, the wrath of God, stands before a bunch of frightened rich men and demands capitulation. He understood what they did not. Resistance is futile. Scipio's machine will not stop. If Carthage does not bend the knee, it will be ground to powder. The peace terms Rome dictated to the defeated were not a treaty. They were a vivisection.
Carthage was stripped of all its colonies. It was forbidden to wage war without Rome's permission. It had to pay a monstrous indemnity for 50 years. But the most terrible clause was the fleet. Go in your mind to the shore of the Carthaginian harbor. Look at the horizon. There stand 500 warships, the pride of a maritime power, the very triremes and quinqueremes that had controlled Mediterranean trade for centuries. The Romans ordered them all burned. It was a spectacle worthy of the gods of destruction. 500 ships were taken out to sea and set on fire. Flames rose to the heavens, black smoke blocked the sun, and ash fell on the heads of weeping Carthaginians on the quay. Rome burned not just wood and sails, it burned its rival's future. It tore the fangs from the lion, turning it into a toothless house cat that would live only as long as the master allowed it to breathe. In that fire, the true Roman Empire was born.
Formally, Rome still called itself a republic. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected. But the essence of the state had changed irreversibly. Rome was no longer a regional power defending its borders from barbarians. It had turned into an apex predator. Look at a map of that time. There was no one left who could say no to Rome. Macedonia will be smashed. Greece will become a province. Syria will bow down. Victory over Carthage removed the last psychological barriers. The Romans understood a terrible thing. Absolute cruelty multiplied by absolute organization yields absolute power. They learned everything from their enemies. From Archimedes, they took engineering. Roman ballistae and catapults, created from stolen blueprints, would become a nightmare for the cities of Europe and Asia. The death of the genius in the dusty room of Syracuse was not in vain for the killers. It gave them technology. From Hannibal, they took strategy. Scipio showed that the Roman legion could be flexible, cunning, and maneuverable. From Marcellus, they took the understanding that the old methods of noble war were dead. Rome became a Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from pieces of its defeated enemies. It became more efficient, colder, and more cynical. A perfect machine for grinding nations. And what of the winners and losers? Hannibal, the greatest mind of his time, would end his life as an outcast. He would wander the courts of Eastern kings, offering his services in the fight against Rome like an old mercenary. And everywhere the shadow of Roman ambassadors demanding his extradition would follow him. Rome does not know how to forgive the fear it experienced. In the end, in distant Bithynia, to avoid capture, 64-year-old Hannibal would take poison from his ring. Let us release the Romans from their heavy anxiety, since they think it too long and too tedious to wait for the death of a hated old man, he would say before dying. The Titan's last mockery. And Scipio, the conqueror of Hannibal, savior of the fatherland? His own country would devour him. The Roman political machine does not tolerate heroes who become too bright. He would be accused of corruption, humiliated by trials, and die in voluntary exile, leaving instructions not to be buried in ungrateful Rome. The system always defeats the individual. That is the main lesson of this war. Look at this new world we have built together over these 10 parts of the story.
We started with screams of terror on the decks of ships at the walls of Syracuse, where Archimedes' genius broke Roman spines. We passed through the bloody fields of Italy, where Marcellus chased a ghost. We saw elephants burning in the sands of Africa. And where have we arrived? We have arrived at the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a world where order is guaranteed by the legion, where roads are straight, laws are harsh, and taxes inevitable. It is a world where it is safe to walk the streets, but only if you are a citizen, and only if you keep your mouth shut. The price of this greatness is Archimedes' corpse, soaked in blood on his drawings. The price of this order is the ash of Carthage's burned fleet. The price of this power is Hannibal's broken fate. Rome turned into what it fought against. To defeat monsters, it grew claws and scales itself, and learned to breathe fire. It proved that there is no place for justice in history. There is only force, logistics, and the ability to adapt. Intellect is powerless against organized violence. Beauty is fragile in the face of an iron boot. Heroism is a pretty fairy tale for a tombstone, while empires are built by cynical pragmatists who know how to count money and soldiers. And now, when you look at the ruins of the Colosseum, or the majestic aqueducts that stand to this day, ask yourself one question. A question that should ring in your head like the strike of a Roman gladius on a shield. Are you ready to live in a world of perfect order, knowing that the foundation of this order is mixed with the blood of geniuses and the tears of defeated civilizations? Or perhaps the true tragedy is not that Rome won, but that we, even 2,000 years later, continue to play by its rules, believing that the right of the strong is the only law that really works. Look into the mirror of history. Do you see a wise senator in a toga there? Or do you see the reflection of a predator, simply waiting for the moment to strike?